back to my channel, Get Cozy, or welcome if you're new here. Today's video is a very exciting installment of my series of One Ink and many pens. Now the series is titled One Ink, 9 pens. If you've been with me since I started this series, it started as One Ink and 7 pens, then I acquired an 8th pen, and then recently I acquired a 9th pen. So the title is going to just continue to evolve as my fountain pen collection grows. The purpose of this series is to try one of my fountain pen inks and all of my fountain pens side by side because I'm trying to find the best pen and ink pairings in my collection. Previously, I would just find a pairing that I really liked and I wouldn't really change it, but I have discovered through this series and through just experimentation that there are plenty of pairings of inks and pens that are phenomenal together that I wouldn't have thought of to try otherwise. And so today I am going to be doing Pelikan 4001 Blue Black. I recently had a video where I talked about my favorite fountain pen ink pairing so far this year. I will link it down below. My number one pick, spoiler alert, was this ink with my Pelikan M800. These were my favorite fountain pen and ink pairings so far this year. I still feel this way. I really love these two together. They are a match made in heaven. And it's kind of funny because this being like in the number one spot, I haven't tried this ink in really any other of my pens. I have used it in my Pelikan M1000, but I have not used it in anything else. So I'm really excited to see how it performs. So typically when I am preparing for one of these videos, I like to do a little bit of research in the background of an ink and share it in the video. I did find that the background behind this ink was fascinating, so I will get into that. And then after that, I am going to fill all of my pens on camera. My M800 is currently inked with Pelikan Blue Black, so this one's ready to go, but all of the other 8 pens do need to be filled with this ink. And then I'm going to do some writing samples on 3 different kinds of paper, which I will talk about momentarily. And with those, I will do some ink swatches with the dip pen. At the end of the video, I'm going to look to see which pen was my favorite to use with this ink. I'm really curious if anything else will dethrone my M800, so I will get to that as well at the end of the video. Let me tell you the very interesting history behind this ink. Where this gets really interesting is one of the ingredients in the formula. So historically, Western inks were made from a material called iron gall. Basically, it's made from both iron and oak galls. And I did not know what an oak gall was, so I will put a photo on the screen, but it's basically an abnormal growth or swelling. Some people call it like a tumor that forms on leaves, twigs, branches on some oak trees. And basically, this is part of a response of the oak tree to different insects. It's rich in something called tannic acid, which is really what is useful for creating inks. But basically, it was a formula that was used for dip pens. The properties of the formula contain something called ferrogallic deposits, which can accumulate in the feed and cause clogging of fountain pens. So typically it'd be useful for something like a dip pen, but not used in a fountain pen. And so traditionally also this material was very acidic and it could corrode metal parts. As the formula modernized over time, inks that had iron gall only have a very small amount of it, and the ferrogallic compounds were specifically formulated to be more chemically balanced, and so this would help to prevent any kind of corrosion of metals. But basically, there is a blue dye in this ink, and so whenever you first lay the ink down on paper, you will see that blue dye and it will look very blue and it makes the ink very clearly visible. And then over time, the ferrogallic compounds will oxidize and result in a color change to look a little bit more like a slate gray blue color. So Pelikan 4001 Blue Black is the only ink color in the 4001 lineup that has any iron gall in it. It is a very small amount, but it helps to make this ink more water resistant and resistant to light. Some people call this ink semi-permanent for those reasons. It's also been reported by many fountain pen enthusiasts to be safe for older fountain pens. In 2011 is when the history of this ink gets really interesting, especially here in the US. So suddenly in 2011, Pelikan's US distributor suddenly halted all imports of this specific ink, and it was only the blue-black color in this line. Apparently, An ingredient in this ink failed to comply with the US Toxic Substances Control Act, which is really surprising because ingredients are typically even more heavily regulated in Europe. So for it to fail in the US is pretty crazy and controversial. So for a while, this ink was seen as a little bit of like a contraband ink where people really loved it and then all of a sudden they couldn't get it, at least here in the US. And so they would have to get creative on how to obtain this ink. So in 2023, which is only 3 years ago from when I'm filming this, Pelikan chemists cross-referenced the actual molecular structures in this ink with the modern Toxic Substance Control Act registry, and they found that the ink actually didn't contain any unapproved or non-compliant chemicals. And so the reason for the ban is ultimately unknown from the research that I could accomplish. If you have more information, please leave it down below. I will also include some articles where I source this information from. But some speculation is that there was some kind of clerical misinterpretation of the ingredients, or maybe the ingredient that was flagged was misread or renamed. But it seems like everything has been perfectly safe all along, and the formula was never illegal. So in 2023, this ink came back on the market in the US. And the marketing behind it's really cute. I'll put a image on the screen, but they were saying Pelikan Blue Black is back, and the formula and recipe for the ink was actually never adjusted. So I found that to be pretty interesting and kind of a shame for the people who really love this ink and missed out on it for 12 years. Anyway, so as far as the public consensus goes online, a lot of people say that the positives of this ink is that it really helps to control gusher pens like Pelikans that have a very heavy wet ink flow. People also really like the fact that it goes down as like a midnight blue color, and then over time it will shift to a more gray slate blue color. That's something that I personally really like, and it does have some really beautiful shading, but still looks very professional. Some critiques of this ink is that it's not great with drier writers or with a lot of Japanese pens. So I have some pilots here that I will be assessing. People say that in drier writers, this ink tends to look a bit more washed out, it's too light, and it feels a little bit more scratchy because this is not an ink that has a lot of lubrication ingredients like Pilot Iroshizuku, so it can feel unpleasant to write with in some pens. And then something else I found interesting, just in hindsight of a comment that I saw in a video, is that if you have a pen paired with this ink that doesn't have a very good airtight cap seal, if neglected for too long, this can create like a crust on the feed. And so that is something to keep in mind. And it's probably due to the iron gall ingredient that's in here. I bring this up because I mentioned this being my favorite to pair with my Pelikan M800, which I assume has a really good airtight seal. But somebody had commented asking if I ever had issues with this ink drying out my pen or clogging it. And at the time, I thought that was kind of an interesting question because no, I've never had that issue. I think Pelikan 4001 inks are known to be really safe for fountain pens. It does seem like if you have a pen that doesn't have a very good airtight seal, this can have some issues with the feed. So I just wanted to throw that disclaimer out as well. So if you stayed around to listen to the history of this ink, thank you. I love really nerding out about that kind of stuff. So next what I'm going to do is I am going to zoom you guys in and fill all of these fountain pens with this ink. And by the way, this bottle is 1 fluid ounce. You can get it for 2 fluid ounces on Amazon for about $15. I will have it linked down below. All right, I hope I have enough ink in here for filling my pens. So this is a 1 fluid ounce bottle, and I don't know if you can see, but it's about 50% full, so I have about half an ounce. I think this will be enough. Worst comes to worst, we can do some partial fills. But yeah, I don't know. This ink bottle is not particularly my favorite shape. It doesn't knock over easily, which is great, but it's kind of a strange shape. It's not very modular, so I don't find it to be the easiest for storing. All right, so let me go ahead and just put this ink in the ink miser. The holder that I have for this ink miser is from Fountain Pendulum. It's really wonderful in preventing it from knocking over, so I do really love that. I will link it down below. I got it at the San Francisco Stationery Fest this year, so it's pretty great. All right, so let me go ahead and Move this. Let's fill this ink. As you can see, it is quite dark. Actually, let me revisit the lid. It looks like a very dark midnight blue. I really love the way that looks. On paper, it does look like that when I first lay it down, and over time it does oxidize and change color, which I think is really fun. All right, so let's go ahead and fill my first pen. And then I'm going to speed up the video while I fill the rest of my pens so you don't have to watch it in real time, and I will be right back. My M800 already has ink in it, so I'm going to skip it. All right, so everybody is filled with this ink. So I'm going to zoom out and tell you about the papers I'm going to use, and then we'll do some writing samples. All right, so here are the 3 kinds of papers I'm going to be using for writing samples. And I have these 3 papers here that I've been using in all of the other videos in this series, so I'm going to keep it consistent. The first is going to be with this Midori A5 notebook. This is not regular Midori MD paper, but I do like it because it shows off the color of inks really well. Next, I will be doing a writing sample on this Kanzo Noto notebook. This is exclusive to jet pens, and this is with Tomoe River S paper. This paper is from one of the batches that is very prone to feathering and bleeding, and I really like using this paper for this series because it is a very harsh critique on ink and pen pairings, and so it will give me a sense of how well behaved an ink and pen pairing is. And then finally, I will be doing a writing sample in my Hobonichi Weeks. I have some note pages in the back I've been devoting to this, and so we'll get to see how that looks. And then finally, I have a Nemosin Marmon notepad. I have been experimenting with this paper and have been doing some writing samples in here. I'm not going to do this one on camera, but I'll do a writing sample in here and show it at the end as like a bonus. So I'm going to have writing samples for 9 different fountain pens. I have 5 Pelikans, 3 Pilots, and a Kaweco. And then I will also be using the dip pen. So let me zoom you in and we will start with the Midori notebook. Okay, so there you have it. One ink tested in 9 different fountain pens, plus a dip pen on 3 different kinds of paper. Now, I've already very carefully inspected all of these, and I have a lot of thoughts, and I also feel a little bit conflicted. So, let's just talk first about the typical criteria that I am looking for when I am pairing an ink with a pen. I'm thinking about how the ink feels coming out of the pen, how well it behaves, and does the pen reveal any kind of shading, sheening, or fun ink properties, and does the ink look saturated? Before I do some close-ups of these writings, I want to show how this ink has looked in some of my previous writing because I have used it quite a bit in my Pelikan M800. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this ink oxidizes over time and the color kind of changes. And so these are all writing samples that are fresh from today, but I think it just looks really cool on some previous writings. So let me pull those out. This is how it looks in my personal journal. This is on Tomoe River Paper from Hobonichi. Again, it looks very beautiful and dark and it has oxidized over time. This is an entry from February and it's June as I'm filming. So that's how it looks. And I have a more recent writing sample I can compare it to. This is how it looks in May. So this is just about a month ago. So if we look carefully, the writing sample from May on the right-hand side definitely looks more blue to me than the one on the left in February. So you can definitely see that over time, this does look more like a traditional blue-black as it oxidizes. And it's subtle. I think that as time goes on, it'll be more obvious, but that's just something that I think is really cool about this ink. Okay, so let's talk about some of these criteria to identify the best ink and pen pairing. So the first thing that I'm really looking at is how fluid, wet, and lubricated the ink feels coming out of the pen as I write across the page. Now, this matters to me because I think normally I reach for a fountain pen because I really love how it feels to write with that glide. It's very tactile, very satisfying, and so the way that it feels is really going to dictate what kind of ink I choose to put in a pen. So, this is where I felt very surprised the beginning of this video, I mentioned that public opinion is that this ink is very dry and does not feel good coming out of pens that write dry. And so typically, Japanese pens are cited for that. So I have personally used dry inks in my Pilot Kakuno and my Pilot Decimo, specifically J. Bon, Cacao do Brazil, and also Pelikan 4001 Royal Blue. I did not like how those inks felt coming out of these pens, way too dry. But this ink, for some reason, did not feel that dry coming out of these pens. Now, it felt drier than my Pelicans and even these two, but it was still a very pleasant writing experience. I would not be opposed to putting this ink back in these pens based on how it felt. So I don't know much about the formula of inks when it comes to lubrication, but it does feel like this ink was more pleasant to write with coming out of these pens compared to a lot of other drier inks that I've tried. So I found that to be a very pleasant surprise. Now, as far as the other pens go, it was very pleasant with all of them. Obviously, the Pelicans went as expected. They were really wonderful to write with. And same with the Lilliput. And surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, the Pilot Custom 823. I didn't really know how this would feel, but it was very wonderful. This is a very buttery, smooth nib, just like the Pelikan M800. So very comparable writing experience to the Pelicans, in my opinion. Okay, so the other criteria that I look at are feathering and ghosting, also bleed through, just to see how the ink and pen behave on the page. I also look to see if an ink pulls out any kind of shading, sheening, or other fun ink properties. And then I also look to see how saturated the ink looks coming out of the pen. So for these last 3 criteria, let's look at the writing samples close up. Okay, let's start with the Midori paper. Now, if we look very close, the lines are not the most crisp, okay? But I don't know if I would really call that feathering. So it's pretty good across the board, even for the very wet and juicy pens. And then as far as ghosting and bleed through, There's virtually none. I mean, the ghosting is there for sure, but it is very minimal, and I would definitely use the back of this page to write on. Now, this ink doesn't really sheen, but there's definitely a lot of really pretty shading, and it looks like a really pretty like watercolor effect. You can see that there are certain parts of the writing that look darker and lighter, and that is one of my favorite parts of this ink. And then as far as saturation goes, it's pretty well saturated across the board. I'm kind of surprised the Kaweco Lilliput looks the least saturated of the bunch. I kind of anticipated the two pilots here, the Kakuno and the Decimo, to be the least saturated, but they're actually very well saturated, so very pleasantly surprised by that. And of course, for all the Pelicans, it looks saturated, and the Pilot Custom 823 probably looks the darkest to me. What do you guys think? Okay. So this is the Tomoe River S paper in the Kanzo Noto notebook. This paper is prone to feathering and bleed through, and I'm very happy to report that once again, this ink behaved very well in all of the pens. So this is how it looks close up. Again, not the most crisp, but I definitely would not call that feathering. If it is feathering, it's very, very minimal. To show an example of some significant feathering, we can look here. This is with an Oroshizuku ink. There's definitely a lot more feathering with that ink. This is not super crisp, but I would definitely hesitate to call this feathering if at all. So yeah, it looks very well behaved across the board. And then as far as ghosting goes, again, there's definitely some ghosting, but it's very minimal. Would still use the back of this page and no bleed through at all. No sheening, definitely some really pretty shading again. And as far as saturation goes, again, the Pilot Custom 823 looks the most saturated, and the Lilliput looks less saturated. Okay, and then let's look at the Hobonichi Weeks. So this definitely has the most crisp lines compared to the other two papers. So if we look close up, you can see that. So nice. This ink looks so good in all of these pens on this paper. And then as far as ghosting goes, very minimal. I mean, very, very minimal and no bleed through. And then once again, no sheening, but definitely a good bit of shading. And you can see the shading on every single writing sample. I mean, even the Kakuno and the Decimo have shading, which I don't really see shading a whole lot from those pens, so that was really beautiful to see. And then as far as saturation goes, again, it's pretty light in the Lilliput compared to the rest. On this paper, I feel like there's not as much variability in saturation across the board. Maybe the M1000 and the Custom 823 are the most saturated. And then I also did a writing sample on the Nemosin A7 notepad that I have, and this is how it looks. This notepad tends to make the line widths for each pen look a lot narrower, and so this is how it looks. So pretty. The Kaweco Lilliput is the lightest, but for the rest, they look very similar to each other. Okay, so now comes the part of the video that is going to be really challenging for me right now. So I need to find the best pen for this ink. Let's do some process of elimination. I think that my least favorite pen to use with this ink, surprisingly, was the Kaweco Lilliput. I really love this pen, and I still like these paired together. I don't dislike it, but it does look to be the least saturated and the lightest in color with the Lilliput, so for that reason, it's not my favorite. And then while I really loved this ink in these pens and it was better than expected, my Pilot Decimo and Kakuno, I do think that the smaller line width is just not my favorite to show off the shading properties. So I would still put this ink in these pens again and enjoy it. But as far as choosing my favorite pen for this ink, it just doesn't celebrate the shading properties as much as I would like. And then I think same goes for the Pelikan M250. This pen writes like an extra fine. It's a very fine. It's not like regular Pelikan nib. And I think for the same reason as the pilots that I mentioned, this is not going to be my number one pick. And that narrows it down to 5 pens. Okay. Um, hmm. My brain is going in multiple directions because I feel compelled to reach for my higher end pens. So my Pilot Custom 823, Pelicans M1000, and M800. I did really love this ink in these two pens. This is the Pelikan 140 with an oblique fine nib and a Pelikan 120 with a broad nib. And I think that this ink performed really well in these pens. The shading looks really beautiful. The writing experience was really nice with these, but I hesitate to call these my favorites for a couple of reasons. One, when I was reading about this ink, yes, I saw that it is safe for vintage pens, but I did see that if you don't have a very good seal in the cap, then it can impact some crust buildup. And so I hesitate to say that the 140 is my favorite pen for this ink for that reason. I think that the cap has actually been fine, but it's an older pen, so I think it's more likely to be fussy in this pen. And then as far as this one goes, I really liked it. So, ugh. All right, so I have it narrowed down to these four. So Pilot Custom 823, Pelikan 120, M800, and M1000. These two surprised me, and I am just really struggling here. I feel a little bit conflicted about this. So, okay, let's talk about it. I really thought that the M1000 that made 100 were gonna be a tie for the best. I already talked about how this was my favorite pair for ink and pen this year so far, and I already knew that I liked it in my M1000, and I do really love this ink in these pens, but my steel nibbed Pelikan M120, just with that broad nib, really shows that shading really beautifully and just a little bit more than the extra fine nibs on the M800 and the M1000. And the Pilot Custom 823 is very saturated, and I am very biased towards Pelikan, obviously. So I know that the 800, the M800 and the Custom 823 are compared a lot, and I do feel a very strong bias to Pelicans. So I am a little bit of a snob um, and feeling biased towards Pelicans, but I think the Pilot Custom 823 dethroned the M800 for this ink and pen pairing. Between these two, I really can't pick a difference, I'm sorry. They are going to have to be a tie. This is so unexpected for me. So my favorite is with the Pelikan M120 and the broad nib and the Pilot Custom A23 with the medium nib. Are you guys as surprised as I am? This was really hard. I know I'm gonna have to like edit this to be a lot shorter because I hemmed and hawed for a really long time, but I think that both of these pens have broader nibs, so they really show the shading properties really well, and the ink looks very saturated from these pens across the board. So that is the verdict. I know that I will continue to use this ink in my other Pelicans, especially in my M800, because I just really love those paired together. But yeah, I guess I'm going to have to start putting it into my other pens as well. So I am so pleasantly surprised with how well this ink worked in every single pen. This is always a happy surprise. And I think I'm gonna have to go decompress a little bit after making such a difficult decision. So there you have it. I am going to wrap up this video. I would love to know what your thoughts are. Have you used this ink before? Do you also feel that this ink is a universal ink for all pens, or have you had a less positive experience with this? Also, let me know what your thoughts are on me dethroning my M800 with a steel nib Pelikan and then also with the Pilot Custom A23. I feel conflicted, but I'm trying to be objective. So if you liked this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up or a subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!